Something shifted this week in the Shedeur Sanders conversation, and I want to be precise about why it matters. This wasn't a beat reporter reversing course. It wasn't a social media personality updating their take. The voices that changed their position this week are the same ones who spent months finding reasons to pump the brakes on Shedeur. The analysts who refused to call him a top 20 quarterback before the draft. The panel members who kept qualifying every positive observation about him with a reason it might not hold up. Those voices, this week, said the quiet part out loud. There is genuine greatness inside Shedeur Sanders. The roster was built for him to succeed, and Deshaun Watson, $185 million paid, 3 good games returned, is fighting for his professional survival. When the people most resistant to your rise start confirming what everyone paying honest attention already knew, that is not just a moment. That is a turning point in a conversation that has been building for over a year. Let me start with the analytical shift that I think matters most, because the context around it is everything. One of the panel's own analysts had been refusing for months to answer a specific question. Can Shedeur Sanders be a top 20 quarterback in 2026? Every time it came up, the response was the same deflection. After the draft. I'll answer it after the draft. Well, the draft is over. The picks are in. And the answer that finally came out is worth sitting with before we move past it too quickly. Yes, with the offensive line additions, with Concepcion and Denzel Boston and Isaiah Bond and Spencer Fano, with a coaching staff that believes in the system being built around him, yes, Shedeur Sanders can absolutely be a top 20 quarterback in 2026. That's the commitment that wouldn't be made before the draft. The reasoning behind it is directly tied to what the Browns have done organizationally, which tells you the analyst understood from the beginning that the question of whether Shedeur could succeed was always more about the environment surrounding him than about anything the player himself could control. The organizational investment is the part of this story that I don't think is getting the attention it deserves in terms of what it actually signals. The Cleveland Browns have spent approximately $100 million on the offensive line this offseason. $100 million. Titus Howard. Zion Johnson. The pieces to construct a functioning, professional-grade protective structure around a young quarterback who spent his first NFL season operating behind one of the worst lines in professional football. Add George Warhop as the offensive line coach, a man with a documented track record of developing linemen and maximizing the production of units that arrived as question marks, and the argument that Shedeur's performance issues last season were primarily an environmental problem rather than a quarterback problem becomes very difficult to honestly dismiss. The talent was there. The support structure wasn't. When those two things finally converge, real talent meeting real organizational commitment, the results tend to be dramatic and fast. Cleveland is about to find out what Shedeur Sanders looks like when the architecture around him is finally built to support what he's actually capable of. The caveat attached to that top 20 projection is worth examining honestly, because I think it reveals something important about the specific developmental step this coaching staff is watching for. The concern expressed is this: Shedeur has to take the layups. When the simple throw is available, the completion that moves the chains and keeps the drive alive without requiring a spectacular execution, he has to take it. This is not a criticism of his talent. It is an observation about the tendency of gifted quarterbacks to see the bigger play when the disciplined play is sitting right there in front of them, and the recognition that the most efficient versions of elite quarterbacks know when to be spectacular and when to be completely boring. 3rd and 4, 5-yard out route open on the left, take it. Don't look for the touchdown. Don't scan the field for the play that ends up on the highlight reel. Take the 5 yards, move the chains, stay on the field. Learning that balance, genuinely trusting a system when the system is asking you to be disciplined rather than explosive, is the developmental step that separates quarterbacks with greatness inside them from quarterbacks who consistently and sustainably deliver that greatness. Here's what makes the current situation so fundamentally different from last season, and why the same caveat in a different context produces a completely different result. Last year, Shedeur was theoretically supposed to be taking those layups to receivers who weren't generating consistent separation. The easy throws weren't easy because the targets weren't getting open. The completion percentage pressure came from a personnel situation where the routes weren't creating the windows the system required. This season, Denzel Boston is a legitimate red zone threat who can win contested catches against NFL coverage. Concepcion provides a vertical element that opens up the underneath throws by forcing safety rotation. Jerry Jeudy is operating in a contract year with everything to prove, which historically produces a specific kind of focused professional performance from veteran receivers who understand that this is their opportunity to reset their market value. The layups are going to be there this year in ways they weren't before. The question the tape will answer is whether Shedeur consistently takes them when they're available. Now let me take you to the Watson side of this conversation, because the panel's handling of it was genuinely the most illuminating part of the entire exchange, and I want to give you every piece of it rather than just the comfortable summary. The number that was put on the table is $185 million paid against 3 good games returned. That is the Watson ledger in Cleveland. Not 19 games contributing to a winning record, not a franchise that felt at any sustained point like it had found the answer at quarterback, 3 good games out of a historically expensive contract. And now Watson is walking into an offseason camp, no pads, no live contact, operating against what some evaluators consider a top 5 defense, trying to generate enough evidence to take a starting job from a player who, on a 5-win team with arguably the worst supporting cast in the league, brought genuine confidence to that huddle and made that offense believe it could compete. That last point is the one I keep returning to because it was stated directly and specifically from someone who watched the film. At points last season, that Cleveland offense actually believed it could win games when Shedeur was under center. There was something he brought to that huddle, a quality of competitive certainty, a kind of leadership presence that made players around him believe in the possibility of success despite the objective circumstances surrounding them. That's not a statistical category. There's no combine test for it. It doesn't show up in the box score. But experienced coaches and teammates feel it immediately and unmistakably, and it is one of the most valuable things a quarterback can bring to a professional football environment. Watson is being asked to go produce that same quality against a first-team defense in an off-season camp. That is the standard Shedeur already set with far less around him. The panel's honest assessment of what Watson's track record actually says was refreshingly direct, and I think it's worth engaging with that honesty rather than softening it. Watson has not been a good quarterback in 6 years. The production deteriorated before the injury interruptions, and the injury interruptions complicated the ability to determine exactly where his career was headed regardless. The argument that Kevin Stefanski's offensive system was wrong for him, that Todd Monken's approach might unlock something that wasn't missing, but just misapplied, is theoretically possible. Quarterbacks do sometimes find new systems that restore or reveal capabilities the previous context suppressed. It happens in this league. But possibility is not probability, and the burden of proof is not equally distributed between a player who has already demonstrated leadership, competitive presence, and the ability to elevate a bad team's belief in itself, and a player working off 6 years of declining production and a physical history that raises legitimate questions about sustained availability. The tape will roll. That was the honest conclusion. The camera doesn't play favorites, and the competition will produce evidence, regardless of what any analyst predicts in advance. What happens if Watson wins the competition? The panel addressed this directly, and the answer wasn't comforting to Watson supporters. One voice said it plainly. You would have to be desperate to start Deshaun Watson at this point. His track record over the past 6 years says what it says, and if Monken names Watson the starter, that decision communicates something specific about where Monken believes Shedeur's development currently stands, which is the only honest interpretation available. But here's the part that I think genuinely reframes the entire Watson argument in a way that cuts through everything else being discussed. If Watson gets named the starter, it is not because $185 million influenced a football decision. The money is spent. It doesn't come back regardless of who takes the first snap in Week 1. Sunk cost is sunk cost, and any organization that makes current competitive decisions based on recovering past expenditures that cannot be recovered is an organization that has already decided to lose in the name of avoiding the appearance of a bad decision. The question is never what we already paid. The question is always what gives us the best chance to win right now and build towards something sustainable. When you strip away the contract value and the historical reputation and whatever organizational politics might exist, and just ask which quarterback gives Cleveland the best chance to win, the evidence has been producing the same answer for months. Let me talk about what this offseason construction actually tells you at the organizational level, because I think the investment pattern communicates something that's more definitive than most people want to acknowledge directly. You don't spend $100 million on an offensive line for a quarterback competition. You spend it for a specific quarterback you've already decided is your guy and whom you're committed to protecting. You don't use 2 first-round picks, one on an offensive tackle who will be responsible for protecting that quarterback on every single dropback, one on a receiver whose route versatility fits the specific system being installed. For a situation you're genuinely uncertain about, every major resource decision this offseason, the offensive line investment, the receiver additions, the coaching infrastructure, the system design, flows downstream from one organizational conviction that was made before most of the public conversation caught up to it. Shedeur Sanders is the franchise quarterback of the Cleveland Browns, and the team being assembled around him is specifically engineered to maximize what he can become when the external environment finally matches what he's been operating with internally. The Cleveland situation last year was, in a very specific way, a controlled experiment that nobody designed intentionally. You had a quarterback with genuine talent, genuine leadership presence, and genuine competitive character operating in circumstances that were structured to make him fail. Minimal first-team repetitions in training camp, inadequate protection, inconsistent receiver separation, an organizational environment that communicated uncertainty about him rather than commitment to him. He produced anyway. Not the kind of production that shows up in a highlight package, but the kind that shows up in the way teammates respond in the huddle, and the way a coaching staff eventually looks at a player and decides this is who we're building around. What happened last season, with nothing around him, is the argument for what happens this season when everything is finally around him. The broader significance of what changed this week is something I want to name clearly before I close, because I think it's easy to receive analyst shifts as just a change in the media temperature without recognizing what they actually represent. The people who were most resistant to the Shedeur narrative, the analysts who found every available reason to qualify the positive observations, to reserve the top 20 commitment until the situation proved itself, to maintain skepticism as a professional default. Those people looked at the organizational construction Cleveland assembled this offseason and concluded that the environment Shedeur needed has now been built. That is not a casual observation. That is the people who were most motivated to maintain the critical position looking at the evidence and finding they can no longer maintain it honestly. That kind of convergence from skeptical voices carries more informational weight than a dozen supportive takes from people who were already convinced. Deshaun Watson is breathing, eating, and sleeping football right now because he understands at a level that doesn't require analysis that this is his last real shot. That kind of desperation generates genuine effort, and genuine effort in an off-season camp can produce real competitive performance in the short window of evaluation available. I want to acknowledge that, honestly, rather than dismiss it. But effort in a no-pads off-season setting does not undo 6 years of declining production, 2 Achilles surgeries, and a competitive track record that $185 million could not make look adequate. What it can produce is a window of performance that forces a genuine evaluation rather than a foregone conclusion. And in that genuine evaluation, one quarterback walks in having already proven he can lead a huddle with nothing around him, already proven he can complete 80% of his passes in minicamp, already proven that something in the way he operates makes a struggling team believe it can win. That quarterback now has $100 million of offensive line protecting him, legitimate receiving weapons running routes for him, A head coach who called him an elite playmaker publicly and is using every available technological and coaching resource to optimize his development. The evaluation that last season could never be fair is finally going to happen in conditions that actually tell you something real. And everything the evidence has been building toward for over a year says the answer it produces is going to be worth waiting for.